When teens take on a summer job at a grain storage facility, they have no idea of the sickening danger they will encounter, bringing them face to face with life and death decisions. This is the fatal breakdown of the Consolidated grain bin accident. 14-year-old Wyatt Whitebread was excited about starting a new summer job after his first year of high school was finished. Matt Schaffner, the manager of a local grain storage facility, was looking for workers, and his daughter MJ had asked Wyatt if he was interested. She had already recruited a friend of his, Chris Lawson, so the three teens would be working together this summer. On July 19, 2010, he started working grain for the Consolidated Grain and Barge Company at the Hosbach facility in Mount Carroll, Illinois, where his job was to get inside the grain bins and walk the corn down from the edges. He used a pickaxe and shovel to break up the clumps of moldy corn. This grain was the last from earlier harvests, and the rainy weather had kept it moist and sticky. People wouldn't be eating this corn. It would be used for fuel and fermentation in industrial applications. At the bottom of each bin, there were 3 doors to let grain flow out to the conveyor belt. A long spiral bar, called a sweep auger, spun around the base of the bin to move the corn toward the holes. Because this corn was old and clumpy, it tended to stick to the sides of the bin and hold up the flow of grain. Wyatt's goal was to knock the corn down toward the center funnel where it flowed out to the conveyor belt. He was told to stay away from the center funnel, because it was like quicksand if you got too close. He was careful to stay along the edges and get the corn moving in the middle. So far, he was not that impressed with the job. The temperature inside the metal bins was unreal, at least 20 degrees hotter than the air outside. In the heat of the summer, it was always over 100 degrees in the silos. The corn dust was everywhere, and it created a thick paste on his body and face. Wyatt wasn't sure how long he'd be able to keep this up, but was glad to have the money for now. After a few days, he was joined by another new guy, Will Piper. He was a neighbor of the boss, so he was brought in to get this old corn moving before the fresh supply was due to arrive. Will was a high school graduate, but hadn't really figured out what he was going to do with himself. In the meantime, he had just turned 20 years old and appreciated a little work to help pay the bills. When Matt offered him the job, he immediately thought of his 19-year-old best friend Alex Pacas, who he called Paco. Matt needed a small team of bin workers, and a group of 4 would be just right. The bins were huge industrial-sized storage bins, nearly 120 feet in diameter and 50 feet tall. Wyatt showed Will how to walk along the edges of the corn and use the axe and shovel to break up the clumps. He gave him the key instruction, which was always to stay away from the center funnel. Thousands of pounds of shifting corn could easily swallow you up, and the amount of pressure it exerted would be enough to paralyze your limbs and squeeze your chest so tightly that lungs couldn't expand to breathe. On Tuesday, July 27th, Paco's first day, Will showed him everything that Wyatt had instructed just a week before. But this would be the last day these best friends would spend together. Ignorant of the disaster to come, they sweated through a tough day at work, then enjoyed a jump off the river bridge into the cold water below after work. It was Wednesday, July the 28th, and the 4 guys were covered in a thick paste of corn dust and sweat. They had been working in bin number 9, with MJ below working the controls to turn on the auger, conveyor belt, and moving trucks through for loading. The temperature had reached about 100 degrees inside the bin, and they wanted to get this corn done so they could get out of there. The 3-foot center sump hole was open, and the corn was moving slowly. It was probably blocked by a big clump of corn, so Matt decided to open a second hole, the intermediate sump, to get things moving. He let the kids know that the next funnel would be opening up, and to keep an eye out for fast-moving corn. Chris and Wyatt were working on one side of the bin, while Will and Paco were on the other. They worked their way around breaking clumps as they moved the grain toward the center funnels. Wyatt was feeling lightheaded from the heat, and suddenly he was laying on his back sliding toward the intermediate funnel. Will and Paco could hardly believe what they were seeing. Wyatt was sliding feet first into a fast-moving funnel of corn. They yelled to Wyatt, who suddenly sprang up from his slide and grasped at the fast-moving corn to try to climb back up. Wyatt screamed for help in a frantic effort to escape the pull of the quicksand. Even though they had been given stark warnings about moving to the middle of the grain, within seconds, a decision was made by both boys. They took a few big steps and dove to grab Wyatt before he was completely swallowed by the corn, but they weren't able to get their hands under his arms to prevent him from slipping deeper. He was buried up to his collarbones in corn. That amount of grain exerted over 500 pounds of pressure on his body, essentially paralyzing him as if encased in concrete. Wyatt used his hands to cover his face, hoping to protect a small pocket of air so he could breathe. The churning continued and he slipped lower and lower. It only took 20 more seconds for him to slip under the surface. As soon as Chris saw that the guys had jumped in to save Wyatt, he raced up the ladder to alert MJ and Matt about what was happening. In just 60 seconds, Wyatt had gone from standing on a hill of grain to completely submerged. He was now at the mercy of the powerful flow of corn. Will and Paco were both waist-deep in the corn swirl and had nothing to grab onto to stop their demise. Wyatt was buried just beneath the surface, and it was sickening. They were completely powerless. Suddenly, the loud roar of the auger below fell silent. Chris had told MJ to turn it off because Wyatt had fallen in. Paco was in nearly up to his chest, and Will was waist-deep in corn. They screamed for help, and a frantic Matt made his way up the ladder to look in the hatch of Bin 9. MJ had already called 911 and sent every worker on site over to Bin 9. Matt tried to use a shovel to pull some of the corn away, but it was a futile attempt. He knew help was on the way, but the boys were slowly settling in lower and lower, with corn up to Paco's chin now. His arms were stuck, with one hand barely above the last bit of grain. Will held onto Paco's hand and wiped the sliding corn away from Paco's mouth. He was in a nightmare, buried up to his neck, unable to help himself in any way. Each new settling of the mound sent more corn toward his face, and he was sputtering through the corn to talk. He begged to be saved. Paco told his best friend to take care of his brothers and sisters. He just wanted to see them graduate. And now he was being crushed by an insurmountable weight. Rescuers had arrived and started up to the top of Bin 9. Matt had moved down to the controls and decided to open the outer sump. He was thinking that this would help get rid of some of the corn on the edges that was falling in on them. As soon as the auger began moving, corn started coming out of all 3 sump holes. Matt had forgotten to shut the other 2 holes. As the rescuers made it to the top of the bin, it was clear that all that movement was pulling the boys deeper and deeper into the corn. They yelled to stop the auger immediately. As the corn settled, Paco was saying the Lord's Prayer while spitting and choking on corn. His hands were stuck and he couldn't even cover his nose and mouth. He was at the mercy of the sinking grain. Even with rescuers making their way into the bin, he slipped under the surface and the top of his hair was visible for only a few more seconds. Will's arm was stuck under the corn, with Paco's hand gripped tightly in his. They were squeezing each other with desperation, but Will was slipping lower in the chaos, and rescuers were just starting to surround the edges of the corn, working their way to reach out for Will. Everything was moving so fast, and suddenly he felt the grip from Paco go limp. The weight of the corn was excruciating, and he couldn't move anything buried under the corn. Will's arms were now trapped, and only the crown of his face peeked out from the mass of grain. Will had just watched Wyatt and Paco disappear beneath the surface of corn, and now he was about to face the same fate. Tom Cravata, one of the rescuers tethered to a safety rope, was able to crawl out to Will. He disturbed the corn and sent a frightening wave of grain down to Will's face. But Tom had the essential life-saving piece of equipment in his hands. It was simply a 5-gallon bucket. A hole had been cut in the bottom, and he thrust the bucket down over Will's head as he yelled and spit the corn from his mouth. Tom reached down into the bucket and scooped the corn away from Will's mouth and nose. It was the first instant that Will realized he might actually live. He was certain that he'd be suffocated by corn just a few seconds before. His mouth was free to suck in air, but his lungs were compressed by hundreds of pounds of pressure. His ability to pull air in to breathe was fading. On the outside, triangles were cut into the metal walls of the bin to allow corn to flow away from the buried boys. Inside, rescue teams moved in quickly with the standard grain rescue equipment. A metal set of walls were used to create a cylinder around the trapped worker. This helped isolate the corn near his body and stop additional grain from burying him deeper. The shields were carefully moved into place, but they encountered a devastating problem. Paco's body was so close to Will, they couldn't isolate him without squeezing Paco inside the cylinder. Will had to hold on to his friend's lifeless body while they attempted to scoop the grain out of the cylinder. Once there was enough room to help Will, they harnessed him to assist in pulling his exhausted body from the bin. It took 6 hours to free Will from his entrapment. After another 6 hours of removing corn from the bin, they finally located the bodies of Wyatt Whitebread and Alex Pacas. Autopsies showed that they died by mechanical asphyxiation. They simply could not expand their lungs to breathe. They would have lost consciousness in less than 2 minutes, and been brain dead just 5 or 6 minutes after being sucked under. Even the fastest response would not have been able to get to Wyatt in time. If things were done differently, it's unknown whether Paco could have been rescued as well. The specially trained rescue teams did everything possible, with incredible speed, to save the boys. If they had been wearing the OSHA-required tethered safety harnesses, which had not been provided to them, they may have avoided this disturbing death. Dozens of farmers and workers die every year in these tragic and largely preventable grain bin accidents.